meeting is being recorded.
Hello, everybody. We're back with Timothy's Academy. Our featured speaker on these videos is Kevin McAleer. He's an author many times over. Find his books on Amazon or palmartpress.com, I believe. Now, we took a couple weeks off for various reasons, and we're going to be starting back up again, hopefully regularly every Saturday here. And what we were doing a couple weeks back was the works of James M. Cain. We started with Double Indemnity, the screenplay, as well as the book. And we then went on to Postman Always Rings Twice. And this week we're covering the third great novel of James M. Cain called Mildred Pierce. And that is Kate Winslet, who is the star of the 5-part miniseries version. We all know that Joan Crawford starred in the original movie version, I believe, what, 1950 or so?
1945.
Oh, 45. Okay.
And directed by the director of Casablanca, whom no one can ever name. They can name all the players.
Michael Curtiz?
Well, you can, but I think that 9/10 of people who claim to love Casablanca can't name the director of it. But yes, the great Michael Curtiz, who was a great director in the career of Errol Flynn, for one. Great Warner Brothers director. And so, yeah, he was there and on the ground floor in terms of film noir. I think we could classify his rendering of the novel as a film noir version.
Right, right. And as for this 5-part miniseries, are you familiar with that at all?
No, I'm not. No.
Okay. All righty. Now, before we begin, I just want to be completely transparent on my end. I didn't read much of the book. I'm only in the middle of chapter 4 right now. I've had various issues I've had to deal with this last couple of weeks, so I didn't really have time to get through the whole thing or even much of it. But I did see the movie version as recently as about a year ago, and I've seen it 2 or 3 times, so I'm quite familiar with the novel. Kevin, on the other hand, I believe you read the whole thing this time around, Kevin?
Yeah, for about the second or third time.
Okay. All right. So give us your opinion of the book.
Wonderful book. And there is a bit of a disconnect for readers, I think, of the previous novels that we discussed of James M. Cain, Double Indemnity and The Postman Always Rings Twice. Because here he just changes everything completely. Everything. It's a different James M. Cain. If you didn't know who the author of this was, and you had read Double Indemnity and The Postman Always Rings Twice with great care to style, to voice, to plot, to narrative technique in general, you would never guess that this was James M. Cain. Never. I was just making notes in the first few chapters. For example, he used a semicolon. Has he been reading Henry James in the meantime? That's not the hard-boiled James M. Cain I first became acquainted with and learned to love. Straight down the line. Periods, declared a sentence, periods. I would bet there's not a single, I didn't do a semicolon meter on this one, nor did I, of course, do it on the Postman Always Rings Twice and Double Indemnity, because they just, it didn't apply such a meter. But I'm betting there isn't a single semicolon in either of those. In here, there are quite a few. I thought I might run a semicolon-o-meter on this one, but you can see he's taking much greater care. Well, I'm not. That's the wrong way to put it. he has a much more filigreed and delicate style here. And he's using words. I just jotted one down just offhand. He uses words like obtruded. You're not going to find that word in either of those first two novels, obtruded, primarily because he's writing in the voice of these kind of semi-educated, tough guy men of their time. And so they're not going to be using those words. Even an insurance salesman, he's not going to be using that word. But here he uses that word all the time because instead of writing in the first person of a tough, hard-bitten male crook, he's writing in the third person and about a woman who is not a crook, at least initially, who is just in the middle of the Depression. It's spring of 1931 when the book opens, and her husband's a layabout. He's not getting any work, and she's working very hard to make ends meet in the household. They have 2 daughters, and she helps make ends meet, if barely, by making cakes and decorating cakes. So here we have Cain going from a couple scurrilous stories of murder and lust to, in the very first scene, we're in the kitchen, or I think maybe it's the second, because first of all, we're out in the garden with her husband, who's doing a little yard work for once. And then the next scene, we're in the kitchen with her, making a nice little design on the cake. You would never guess it's James and Cain, at least in those first chapters, which you did read. And I love it. I never thought, I'm not one who thinks that an author can switch styles so readily and persuasively pretty much overnight. And I was pleasantly surprised by this whole thing. I hadn't read it in many, many years, perhaps even decades. So when I came back to it, I was just making all kinds of marginalia about, I can't believe this is James M. Cain. I can't believe he's doing this. And another aspect of it that's very new, as compared to his previous stuff, we might leave Serenade out of it. He wrote Serenade in 1937. That came out after Double Indemnity and The Postman Always Rings Twice, because that's a little bit longer. But in comparison to the first 2 short novels, this is a very long novel. And it's not only compressed into a very short period of time, which both those are, but this goes across a decade. The book was published in 1941. It starts out in 1931. So we're basically covering a decade of the Depression. It's a real novel, and I think it's a real novel in the traditional sense, right? The big baggy monster of the 19th century. It's one of those. And Cain himself described it that way. He described it as his first serious novel, right? We should all be so lucky to have written Double Indemnity and Postman Always Rings Twice and term our third great novel as our first serious one. Some guys have all the luck. They're all the talent. So I was very pleasantly surprised. And another aspect of it that was a surprise to me was how in the 2 aforementioned novels, I won't keep repeating their titles, we know what I'm talking about, he is just describing a very sleazy, sordid, lurid world of corruption and greed and lust. It's salacious, it's cynical, and there's no nobility to it, and that's why, well, very little. It peeks out here and there. And that's why Chandler didn't like him. That's why Chandler pretended he didn't like Cain. Because he said, there's just no idealism. There's no nobility here. And I would argue that finally with Mildred Pierce, we have a certain degree of nobility. Because she's very self-sacrificing, and primarily for the sake of her daughter. Veda, I think that's how you pronounce it, Veda. And we'll get back to that in a moment. But what I want to say to finish the thought is that we talked about Chandler in the context of Matthew Arnold's critique of what he felt was the greatest work in literature, the Iliad by Homer, the Greek epic. And he felt it was so because it had the four essential elements that you always need to have a great novel, in his view, which were simplicity, directness, rapidity in the narrative, and nobility. Now, Cain had those first three knocked from the very beginning: directness, simplicity, and rapidity. A master of that, but no real nobility, at least in the two novels we've discussed already. But here you do, I argue, and it's a sad, tragic novel in that sense, because you have Mildred Pierce, who basically is living for her daughter, her eldest daughter. Her name's Veda, and she's a snooty little 13-year-old snob, or 11-year-old snob when we first meet her. Very unlikable, completely unlikable, a hateful person, as it turns out. And she only wants her mother for one thing: to provide for her, to provide the wealth and luxury and riches that she imagines she deserves just by dint of being who she is. And one of the things that she is a talented musician. At least we think so. She's a piano player, and that's where you come in. I wish, I know you couldn't read it, but I wish you had read it to the end, because you could have given us a lot of insight into the musical aspect of it. It should be mentioned that Cain was a trained opera singer, and quite a versatile fellow, this Cain fellow. And he brings that knowledge to bear in his narration of the tale of Vera and her attempts to become a great pianist. That fails eventually. Then she turns out to be a great singer. And all along the way, Mildred, her mother, is trying to advance those career ambitions of Veda. Gets her a nice piano, saves a lot of money, gets her a grand piano when she can't really afford it, pays a lot for piano lessons by a very good teacher, and this sort of thing. And this is the one aspect of it that is very familiar then for those who've read Cain's previous stuff. It's this obsession that she has with her daughter, like the obsession that Frank has for Cora in The Postman Always Rings Twice, and the obsession that Walter, at least initially, has for Phyllis in Double Indemnity. Now, this isn't an erotic obsession as in those two, but in Mildred Pierce, it's the love of a mother for her daughter. And the daughter's obsession, in her turn, for wealth, riches, luxury, and the status that brings. So that's a little bit of an outline of what this novel's about in comparison to his previous two that we discussed, at least, and why I find it to be just a very compelling piece of work all around.
Okay. You've seen the movie version. What's your opinion of the movie? Does it follow the book well? Does it make it even better, or not quite as good as the novel itself?
I saw it a long time ago, and I'm not getting it right, but I think there's a murder in it. And here there's no murder.
Oh,
yeah.
yeah.
There might be an attempted murder or two. Just one, I think. Because at one point, yeah.
I think in the movie version, Veda is the one who murders the guy,
Monty, yeah,
Monty, right?
right,
And Mildred tries to take the blame for it. For
right, right.
so,
That
so
doesn't happen, right?
so that's an important plot point in the movie, that Veda murders this guy and the mother tries to take the responsibility. So if this book doesn't have the murder in it, what is the mother taking responsibility for here?
Well, she's taking responsibility. I mean, I think that's why I said at the top that Michael Curtiz really gave it a big film noir inflection. I think the movie even starts with the murder, and that goes in flashback. I'm not sure.
I don't think so, Kev.
Oh, that's right. That's right. They find her. They find her out on a pier at night.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Oh
I'm not
no,
even.
no.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So the finding of Joan Crawford out on the pier at night, that comes after the murder.
I'm not sure. I really can't speak to it. Everyone who's seen the movie is just shaking their head as I'm speaking. I'm going to stay out of the movie. I'm going to stay out of it.
All right.
So I can't really answer your question, but I remember liking it. You know, despite the fact that they did change that part.
Yeah.
What happens in the book is that finally, after Mildred slaves away and builds this little empire of pie restaurants, basically, she's got one in Glendale. The action mainly takes place in Glendale, as does the action in thank you, Double Indemnity, because Cain lived in Glendale. You know, it's typical writer. He writes about the vicinity he's familiar with.
Yeah.
And so this takes place in Glendale and also in Pasadena, where this Monty lives, this rich, you know, rich boy, because he doesn't work. He's just an heir. He has inherited a lot of money. And Mildred eventually marries him as a way of drawing Veda back into her circle, because they'd had a falling out, because Veda had gotten pregnant, or pretended she'd gotten pregnant, by some rich boy, another rich boy, not Monte in this case, and was blackmailing the family. So she's like 17 years old, so she's underage, so she's blackmailing the family. And when Mildred hears about this, she evicts her from her life. This goes too far for Mildred even. And Mildred takes a lot of stuff from her. And they have slap fights, you know. Mildred gives her a slap, and then Vera whacks her back. I think they show that in the movie.
They do.
Yeah, and so it gets physical even. And at one point, then Vera said, Mildred says to herself, "Okay, I'm going to get her back. I'm going to get her back," and she does it by marrying this Monty, who was just a love interest. She didn't take him seriously as marriage material, but at a certain point, he lost his wealth, and Mildred had to support him, so he became dependent on her. But he still stood for all this high society in Pasadena. Pasadena in Cain's Glendale world was like that was the high society. Yeah, that's where you really put on the Ritz and rubbed elbows with the high and mighty. I guess that was so in LA society back then. I know, San Marino and Pasadena to this day are very, a lot of well-to-do people there. And so she thought she would get Vera back in, the fold by marrying this Monty. Well, what actually happens then is that Vera starts having an affair with Monty. So it does get sordid, right? A la James Cain, as we have gotten to know him, it does get quite sordid. And a murder almost does take place when at one point, because in the meantime, Mildred has also bought this beautiful Pasadena mansion of Monty's, because he had to sell it, and she bought it, as another demonstration to Veda of, look, now I'm buying up the rich boy's mansion. What do you think of Mama now? One of those things. So buys his mansion, marries the guy, all to impress Veda. And Veda is, perhaps not unimpressed, but not impressed to the point where she's not going to then start a love affair with her mother's new husband. And when Mildred finally realizes that her little pie empire is crashing down because she had been embezzling funds to buy all this stuff for Veda, it goes into receivership, and one of her best friends takes over the empire, and or is about to, and then Mildred is advised by her erstwhile lover, a guy named Wally Bergen. He kind of helps her along the whole way. He's kind of on the sidelines, always giving her advice, financial and otherwise. And he says, you're going to have to get Veda to kick in some money, because at this point she's making money as a singer. Right? She's got a lovely voice, it turns out. And so then what Cain has Mildred do is she decides, okay, I'm going to have to finally ask Veda for some money. And she goes, knocks on her door. Or no. She goes to Monty's. She goes to Monty's bedroom. I don't know why she goes to his bedroom first, but anyway, maybe she's looking for Veda. Anyway, it ends up that Veda's in bed, and then in Monty's bedroom, and then Mildred finally puts two and two together, and she goes barging in, and Veda is very cavalier about it. It's like, what do you expect? You're always working, with your pie empire, and says contemptuously, and then Monty makes a snide remark or two. And at that point, after about 250 pages of this little snot, this little insufferable, hate-filled snot of a daughter, Mildred flips out, and she just grabs her by the neck and just, and it's lucky she doesn't kill her. So an attempted murder, perhaps, not premeditated, just a murder of passion. But, Monty gets her off her in time. And at this point, Veda, she immediately goes to the piano to test her voice, because maybe her vocal cords have been hurt. And a croak comes out. Her voice is ruined. So great classic Cain stuff, right? Okay, the chickens come home to roost in a beautiful fashion. And it turns out, though, however, maybe the vocal cords had been initially harmed, but it turns out that actually Veda's okay, and that she then fakes her voice having been kind of destroyed by her mother. Apparently, no charges are pressed. Everyone's cool, no one gets arrested or anything. But then Veda fakes this vocal cord injury to get out of a radio contract that she'd been wanting to get out for a very long time, but they wouldn't let her because she had gotten another offer in the meantime that was much more lucrative, and so she faked the vocal cord injury so the radio contract she had, she could be released from it, and then sign up with the other one. And as soon as she signs up, it's like, hey, cured. Anyway, at this point, Mildred wants nothing to do with Veda. Really, truly, it seems. And Monty's out of the picture. And then her former husband, Bert Pierce, whom she leaves in the first pages of the novel because he's a layabout and everything. They get back together, and
he leaves her.
No. She gives him an ultimatum. She gives him an ultimatum.
But she kicks him out of the house, though.
Yeah, because he's seen another woman, and so she says, "Well, just go, get out of here." Yeah,
that's right.
Anyway, the book ends, and pardon my French, Tim, but it's in the book. Then this Bert says to Mildred, "Hey, Mildred, to hell with her," right? And then Mildred sort of says, "Yeah, to hell with her." And then Bert says, "Let's get stinko. Let's get drunk." And that's how it ends. And that's kind of and that's a pretty good summary, I think, of the book.
There's been the "To Hell with Her" quote is about whom?
Veda.
Oh,
Veda.
so,
Both of their daughter. It's both of theirs daughter. Is that
and
proper English? Both of theirs daughter. Anyway,
I think that does work grammatically.
don't think so. No, sound like one of Cain's early heroes. Can't even get my grammar straight.
So, so Mildred actually walks away from her daughter at the end.
Well, the daughter ends up walking away from her because Veda had come by for whatever reason, and she reveals the fact that she'd been faking the vocal cord injury all this time, and then the scales finally fall from Mildred's eyes, and she has luckily her first husband Bert there to provide emotional support, and that's there's nothing for it. Veda has just from A to Z, she's just proven to be very bad news, to put it mildly. And Mildred has sacrificed everything for her, and in the end, there's nothing left. She doesn't even have her pie empire. Her husband's gone, Monty, presumably with Veda. Veda's gone. It must be said also that they had at the beginning of the novel, they have two daughters, and the other daughter, the younger one, her name's Ray, and they lose her very early in the novel. I think it's the first recorded death in literature by pimple. Cain talks about a little pimple she had on her upper lip, and apparently it got infected to the point where she suffered some kind of reaction.
Wow.
But yeah, I guess in those days, was that before penicillin? Maybe it was. It was 1931 before penicillin, 32, 33?
I don't know.
I don't know. Anyway, she dies. And so now Mildred's obsession with Veda is even greater. Right.
Right.
And there's a great passage, actually. I'd like to read it. Give you some sense of Cain's style at this point. I've been talking about the whole time. And let me see. Okay. I'll get back to the younger daughter dying in a moment. I'll circle back around to it. But here's a nice summary of the relationship between Mildred and Veda early on in the book.
All righty.
She was afraid of Veda, of her snobbery, her contempt, her unbreakable spirit. And she was afraid of something that seemed always lurking under Veda's bland, phony toniness. A cold, cruel, coarse desire to torture her mother, to humiliate her, above everything else, to hurt her. Mildred apparently yearned for warm affection from this child, such as Bert apparently commanded, the father. But all she ever got was a stagey, affected counterfeit. This half loaf she had to accept, trying not to see it for what it really was. And so Mildred is very aware of the fact that Veda doesn't respect her and may not even love her, although she says that often when she gets what she wants. Oh, mother, I love you so much, after she gets like a piano, the grand piano. Cain describes the grand piano coming and Veda kissing it. Beautiful. The only thing she really loves are material objects and things that can enhance her status among the wealthy and the high and mighty otherwise. And what happens then, we get back now to when the daughter dies, when the younger daughter dies of this pimple on the upper lip, And of course, excuse me, I'm sorry, everyone. And of course, Mildred is distraught that her beautiful younger daughter, Ray, has died. But then she becomes even more distraught when Cain writes, "There came torrential shaking sobs, as at last she gave way to this thing she had been fighting off, a guilty, leaping joy that it had been the other child who was taken from her, and not Veda." So the daughter who doesn't love her, that's the one she cherishes more than anything.
Yeah.
It's tragic.
It's a very domestic novel.
Yeah, you would never expect that of Cain. And there's also there's a knowingness he has in describing those domestic scenes, which surprised me, because he was married a couple times, but he never had any children of his own, I don't believe. But there's a real knowingness, the warmth that a family can generate through their togetherness, and particularly in dire circumstances when you got to draw together and support one another. And that really surprised me. And again, it's a completely different Cain in this novel. Completely different.
And another thing I noticed in the first few chapters, oh wait, I lost my train of thought. I apologize. I was talking about the domestic aspect of it. Oh boy.
Well, he goes into great detail, which he never did in the previous novels, except the detail of how people pull off a crime and then try and cheat the insurance or cheat law enforcement, or how the insurance or the law enforcement go about tracking down their culprits, their suspects at very least. He's great at that, but when you get right into it, he's giving you these long descriptions of the interior of rooms, which is very Chandler-esque. It's as if he had read Chandler in the meantime. He even gets a little poetic once in a while. For example, a line like, "He lived in a world of dreams, lolling by the river, watching the clouds go by." Now, that might not sound like much, but compared to the previous prose, that's downright poetic.
Yeah.
And
that's true.
Yeah, right when you start off, I even marked it because it did strike me. The description of the living room after Bert, this first husband of Mildred's, finishes his yard work, he goes into the living room, and there's a half-page description that Cain gives us of the living room. I don't think Cain devoted more than 2 or 3 sentences at most to the description of an interior in any of the previous ones we've discussed, because it slowed down the novel, and he just wanted to move it along. Here, he's more than happy to take his time, give us the setting, give us a sense of the atmosphere and the world that Mildred occupies.
You have a sample of that?
I do. I can give you something. The living room he stepped into corresponded to the lawn he left. It was indeed the standard living room sent out by department stores as suitable for a Spanish bungalow, and consisted of a crimson velvet coat of arms displayed against the wall, crimson velvet drapes hung on iron spears, a crimson rug with figured border, a settee in front of the fireplace flanked by 2 chairs, all of these having straight backs and beaded seats, a long oak table holding a lamp with stained glass shade, 2 floor lamps of iron to match the overhead spears and having crimson silk shades, 1 table in a corner in the Grand Rapids style, and 1 radio on this table in the Bakelite style. On the tinted walls, in addition to the coat of arms, are 3 paintings. One of a butte at sunset with cow skeletons in the foreground, one of a cowboy herding cattle through snow, and one of a covered wagon train plodding through an alkali flat. On the long table was 1 book called Cyclopedia of Useful Knowledge, stamped in gilt and placed on an interesting diagonal. One might object that this living room achieved the remarkable feat of being cold and at the same time stuffy, and that it would be quite oppressive to live in, but the man was vaguely proud of it, especially the pictures which he had convinced himself were pretty good. As for living in it, it had never once occurred to him. So that 1 paragraph has more description of an interior than both of Double Indemnity and The Postman Always Rings Twice put together. I'm sure. I would swear on it. I think there's a description of the house in Glendale when Walter Huff first goes in. There's kind of a lengthy description of that, but not near as lengthy as that. And in that 1 description, that was almost, except for the last couple sentences, that was almost 1 sentence. So you had about 6 or 7 semicolons interspersed in all that.
Oh, wow.
An amazing accomplishment to just, to have this leopard change his spots so drastically, so diametrically, and you not being disappointed. Again, Cain had a great storytelling talent. I don't know what it is, sometimes it's just you're born with it, but he had it. He could switch styles completely and still you're never bored.
Another aspect of it that was interesting to me in those first few chapters I've read was the shop talk around being a waitress and how a restaurant works and how you get the orders and how you have to carry the plates under your arms and how you get it taken out of your paycheck if your bill runs short. All kinds of shop talk on waitressing in restaurants. You had mentioned in Double Indemnity you loved the shop talk about the insurance industry because it's something you're not really interested in or would ever investigate, but he opens that world to us in great detail. He does the same with the waitressing world. Did you find that intriguing at all?
I did. Yeah, I was with you. How actually do these waitresses operate?
Yes.
How do they organize their tasks? How do they carry those 3 plates on an arm? It's interesting.
Yeah.
And that's the mark, I think, of his journalistic training. He would go out into the world and really get the story on things, and because he started out as a journalist. And I do like that very much, giving you the inside dope, the nitty gritty on whatever. And again, even cake decorating, he goes into a long description of the cake decorating, and I'm with him. I never thought I'd be interested in a novel about a woman who decorates cakes. She does more than that. But for example, all its decorations were now in place, the decorations on the cake. But in spite of their somewhat conventional design, it had an aroma, a texture, a totality that proclaimed high distinction. It carried on its face the guarantee that every crumb would meet the inexorable confectioner's test. It must melt on the tongue. This is not Frank or Walter talking here. I love it. I'm really glad we read this because it's a miracle of style.
Miracle of style, unexpected style.
That's what I mean. He pulls off this complete different style, and I'm with him all the way.
Do you believe
and
this is?
and subject matter largely too. Yeah, just a
Yeah,
woman in the Depression trying to make ends meet, and the nuts and bolts of doing that. I mean, Cain was very interested in how people make money. That's one thing. That's one common denominator. He was fascinated by how people actually bring in the dough.
it's a good point.
Yeah.
What about the aspect of a male author writing about a female world? Does he get into the feminine mind correctly? Uh, is
You're
there any,
asking me? I don't know.
well, because that's what some critics will say. They'll say, hey, especially, well, feminist critics would say sometimes, what is a man doing thinking he can get into a woman's world and portray it accurately?
Yeah, I mean, you'll hear that from all these identitarian critics, like
Yes, yes,
how dare even like a white woman write from a write from a Hispanic woman or a black woman's perspective.
right.
I that's completely absurd. The whole point of a writer is to think himself or herself into the mind of someone who is not him, and
Right.
then to create empathy for those characters uh, in his readers. That's one
Sure.
of the tasks.
Sure.
So it's like saying that only someone in a wheelchair can play someone in a wheelchair in a movie. No, that's what an actor does. They pretend. So Daniel Day-Lewis would have never gotten his Academy Award for My Left Foot if we had stuck to that uh, dictum. It's ridiculous.
Okay.
It's an absurd product of our modern era.
So
That
you
kind of critique.
so you reject the identitarian critique of this novel.
I detest it and I reject it with all my being. Yes.
Okay. Okay. Very good. Um, do you think this is his greatest novel?
No, no. I still go with Double Indemnity. But it's a good question because I have been sort of kind of like, particularly with Chandler, revising my order of how I think about his various things. But no, it has boosted him, shall we say, Mildred Pierce, my reading of it has boosted him in my estimation as an author, his versatility.
So would you place this before Postman Always Rings Twice? What's your pecking order here?
Okay, yeah, we've read these three. Okay, we'll keep Serenade out of it because I really enjoy that one. Maybe we'll read it, maybe we won't.
Okay.
Um, no, no, this is a heavyweight of a novel, uh, but the Postman and Double Indemnity, let's call them welterweight or middleweight novels, but they punch way above their weight. And a great middleweight like Marvin Hagler or Sugar Ray Robinson, they're as beautiful, if not more beautiful to watch than, a big heavy hitting heavyweight like Rocky Marciano or Joe Louis. So I'm going to go with the welters or the middleweights that punch above their weight.
Okay. So this is his third novel, and it's the third novel in your estimation as well.
Yeah, in terms of my enjoyment and my uh, admiration for it, and trying to step back a little bit, my own literary estimation of it.
And can you tell me again what years these books were written? The three?
See if I get them right. 1934 was Postman. 1935, Double Indemnity appeared serialized in Liberty Magazine. And then I believe Mildred Pierce came out in 1941. And then I think all three of them in a book called Three of a Kind, if I'm not mistaken. No, I'm probably mistaken. I'm not sure if all those three were in that book, Three of a Kind, or maybe it was Four of a Kind. Getting a little bit jumbled in my reckoning here. But yeah, Postman and Double Indemnity were written very closely together, one right after the other. And then came Serenade, which I've mentioned on numerous occasions. I think that was 1937. And then it took about 3-4 years to write Mildred Pierce, which came out in 1941.
How did the critics receive Mildred Pierce?
That's a good question. All I know is what I see on Wikipedia. I think I looked at it briefly before we got on here, and I think they liked it, but they said that fans of Cain might be disappointed, which I think is a fair judgment. You can see why they would say that. But I think the reviews were positive. I think sales were sort of lukewarm. So maybe what they said was sort of a forecasting of the sales, that fans of Cain might be a little bit disappointed, and that might be it. Because yeah, he as I say, this is like the thesis of our podcast. A complete change in style, a complete change in approach, a complete change in voice, a pretty complete change in terms of subject matter. Yet he has that same narrative drive, just distributed over 3 times the pagination, which is a great accomplishment. Hemingway always talked about how it was very difficult for him to go from writing short stories to his first novel. He said how difficult it was. He writes about it in The Movable Feast. He said that he in his apprentice years in Paris, he'd been just writing short stories. And he's one of the great short story writers, as we have ascertained in the previous podcast. But then to go from writing the short stories to the novel, you got to go from being a sprinter to a marathon runner. And those are 2 diametrically opposed talents. Yeah. You're not going to see the 100-meter Olympic gold medalist all of a sudden saying, okay, good, for a change of pace, I'm going to become a marathon runner, or vice versa. It doesn't work that way. And the example is a little bit extreme, but it's not inapt. I think that, yeah, because you do have great short story writers, you have great novelists, and oftentimes they are not the same. Hemingway happened to be one of those. Yeah, I started out writing short stories myself. I don't mean to mention myself in the same breath with Hemingway, or just on the heels of saying, some great writers, but I started writing short stories. My first book was published with a fellow named Adam Blauhut, who published here in Germany. It was a collection of short stories, and very short stories. And I remember testing those stories at a little poetry slam venue called the Poetry Cafe here in Berlin. And you had to keep the audience's attention over a couple minutes. So you had to keep them short and snappy. And a lot of those stories eventually made their way into the book. And I've continued to write short stories over the years. But at that point, I decided I wanted to write a novel. It was the first novel I wrote was Surfer Boy. And it was a very difficult task to go from writing those short, snappy stories to something of 300 pages length. So I can have sympathy. And with someone like Cain, not going from short stories, but going from very short novels to a much longer one. And at the same time, just completely revamping his style at the same time and pulling it off.
Title of the book. We often ask what you think of the title of the books, and this one obviously is the eponymous Mildred Pierce. Good title, good name for a main character, let's say. I think it has a certain ring to it, or a certain mystique to the name, where you're wanting to say, wait a minute, what woman is named Mildred? Very few. And then you got this nice, short, typical last name, Pierce, Mildred Pierce. Just that, whenever I hear that name, it's just like, that's an intriguing name of a woman. I want to learn who this woman is and what she's all about,
Right. Well, I don't know. I never gave much thought to the title. Just took it as a given. Let's put it this way: if Cain had not established himself with the public with his first 2 or 3 efforts, I don't think that title would have sailed. I think the publisher would have said, "You got to get something a little, sexier. You got to get something a little bit more on the nose."
Well, that you use the word sexy.
Just the name, it's like how many authors just come out with a book with just a name on it,
Right.
before they've established themselves as authors. Not too many, I
Right.
would imagine.
I would say that, Mildred Pierce also has a connotation of domesticated woman. It's not, as you said, it's not a sexy title of some femme fatale kind of thing, like Carlotta Romero, that
Right,
would be like, okay, it's possibly a femme fatale, but Mildred Pierce is as plain white bread, middle class
right,
America as you'd ever want to get.
right. And that's probably what he wanted. But again, he had established himself with these 2, 3 novels before, and the public was just licking its chops for his next entry into the literary sweepstakes. So,
Yeah.
yeah, he could have called it uh,
Mary Smith.
and sold a number of books still. Yes, yes.
Right,
The,
right.
the important name on that book was not Mildred Pierce, but James M. Cain.
Okay. That makes sense. Good point.
I mean, can you imagine me coming out with a book called Mildred Pierce? What's this? You got to if you're going to sell any books with as an unknown writer, you got to come up with kind of sexy titles: Berlin Tango, Surfer Boy, Postdoc, the Foreign and Other Misadventures of a Ne'er-do-well Scholar, L.A. Kid. They're not that inventive, they're not that clever, but they're kind of on the nose and tell you what it's about to a degree. And just having a name isn't going to cut it. So it's a luxury that established authors can afford themselves.
Right, right. Okay. Well, I think that covers most of what we might want to say about this novel. Would you like to do the novel Serenade next week?
I have to get a hold of it. I don't know. I don't know if I can get it in time.
I don't,
Um,
I don't have it either.
yeah, you can get it at the library. I don't have a library that would have Serenade. We'll have to make this a provisional plan. I don't know if I can get it on time. It's a longer novel, so I don't know.
Are you thinking of ordering it from Amazon?
That'd be the only way I could do it. And if it's not available, it's not available, and I just don't have it. So
Okay, so we'll have to figure that out this week.
we'll
And
keep you all posted out there in podcast land.
yes, right.
All right.
Well, tell us. We have about 6 minutes left. Any final thoughts on Mildred Pierce?
Um, I think we pretty much covered it. Well, there's a great portrait of the Italian music teacher. His name's Mr. Treviso, and there's a great scene. And again, it's a shame you weren't able to get through it, Tim, but I hope you will at some point. Where she goes for an audition to this hotshot Italian music teacher to see if he'll take her on as a piano student after her previous teacher has died.
Okay.
And she thinks she's really good. Everyone around her thinks she's really good, really gifted. And what happens in the audition is really grisly. And Cain describes it this way. So you got this Italian guy, and Veda's playing. Mr. Treviso wandered over to the window and stood looking down at the street. When Veda got to the slow part, he half turned around as though to say something, then didn't. All during the slow part, he stared down at the street. When Veda crashed into the fast part again, he walked over and closed the piano, elaborately giving Veda time to get her hands out of the way. In the bellowing silence that followed, he went to the far corner of the studio and sat down, a ghastly smile on his face, as though he had been prepared for burial by an undertaker who specialized in pleasant expressions. You can just imagine that. And that's how he said, "I'm sorry, my dear. You're not going to be my pupil." That's actually one of the most bloodthirsty scenes in the entire novel. And so again, you have these little old, I was going to say old school Cain, but Cain, as we have grown to know him, touches where it's like really sends shivers up your spine, even though perhaps no mayhem is being committed.
Is there any suspense in this novel?
Yeah, there's one scene where she's going out to see Monty from Glendale to Pasadena, and there's a big rainstorm. I think Cain checked it out. It was like there was a real rainstorm in the early 30s, and it just swamped LA. And he describes her in the car trying to make it out there, and there's a little suspense there. She's going to make it. She's the heroine of the novel, but what's this going to do to her relationship to her daughter, to Monty, to her business? Will she survive intact? We don't know. That's a suspenseful one, and that seems to have been real life. That storm that he described.
Okay, because he surely was a master of suspense when we talk about his first two novels. So I'm wondering if he put little touches of it at least into Mildred Pierce. I will say the movie version is full of suspense, the movie. But as I said, I didn't read the book completely this time, so I won't be able to know how it works in the novel, the suspenseful aspects.
No, there are no suspenseful aspects like in Double Indemnity and The Postman Always Rings Twice.
Mhm.
Like, are they going to get away with it or something like that?
Yeah.
It's just, how far will Mildred be pushed by this hateful daughter of hers? How far until she snaps? And then we see.
I see.
And then the tension is relieved.
All right, my friend. Well, listen, we're at the end of our hour. I appreciate your expert insight into this and all the novels we've covered, along with short story collections of Jack London. And you and I will decide where we go from here for next week once we get offline. So I'll be signing off now. Thank you very much, Kevin.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
See ya. Okay.